The evening rush at Donovan's, an upscale restaurant in the heart of San Diego, was in full swing. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warmth, casting light over polished wooden tables draped in pristine white linen. Silverware gleamed under the delicate illumination, and the rhythmic murmur of conversation blended with the quiet movements of waiters, their steps barely audible against the marble floor. Every plate was an artwork, every motion a careful dance of precision and grace. At the very center of the room sat a trio of women, their laughter ringing above the subdued chatter. The leader among them was Evelyn Monroe, a woman who did not simply possess wealth, she embodied it. Draped in a perfectly tailored blazer, the sparkle of her diamond necklace and the gleam of her designer watch were impossible to ignore. She carried herself with an effortless air of superiority, sipping wine with the ease of someone accustomed to being served. Evelyn believed in hierarchies, and in her world, she was always at the pinnacle. Across the room, a young waitress moved through the maze of tables, her uniform crisp but slightly worn from long hours. The small name tag pinned to her chest read, Emily, though it was barely noticeable against the dark fabric. She had been working tirelessly for weeks, every shift bringing her closer to her dream of affording college. But exhaustion clung to her like a shadow, evident in the slight misstep she took as she carefully set down a tray of glasses. Evelyn saw it immediately. A slow smirk curled her lips. To her, people like Emily were nothing more than background noise, until they made a mistake. The night took an uncomfortable turn when Emily finally arrived at Evelyn's table, carefully placing down their entrees. Her voice, though polite, carried a nervous tremor. "Here you are, ladies. I hope you enjoy your meals." Evelyn barely spared her a glance before arching a single, unimpressed brow. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. She nudged her plate ever so slightly forward, inspecting it with disdain. "Is this your idea of medium rare? Because it certainly looks overcooked to me. And what's with the wait? We've been sitting here forever." Emily blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. I'm so sorry, ma'am. Let me take this back and—" "Oh, spare me the apology," Evelyn cut in sharply. Her friends exchanged knowing glances, their amusement barely concealed. The spectacle entertained them. "Honestly, it's not that hard to get an order right. Or is it?" A deep flush crept up Emily's face, her hands trembling ever so slightly at her sides. The air in the restaurant seemed to still, every breath held in anticipation. A quiet tension settled over the room, thick and suffocating. In the corner, a man sat in a simple gray suit, watching. He had been silent the entire evening, his presence unassuming, his expression unreadable. But his eyes never left the unfolding scene, and the night was far from over. Emily's hands shook as she carefully lifted Evelyn's plate from the table, willing herself to remain steady. She gave a small, polite nod, her voice quiet but composed. "I'll have this fixed right away," she murmured, turning swiftly toward the kitchen. But Evelyn wasn't finished. "Unbelievable!" she scoffed, her voice deliberately loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "They'll hire anyone these days, won't they? I mean, how hard is it to carry a plate of food without looking like you're about to drop it?" Laughter erupted from her friends, their amusement sharp and unkind. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, basking in the attention. "She probably thinks a smile and a nervous little stammer will get her a tip. Honestly, I should report her for ruining the entire evening." At the kitchen door, Emily hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the plate, her grip so firm that her knuckles turned white. Her face burned, her pulse roaring in her ears. She could feel the sting of tears welling up, but she forced them back. She had dealt with rude customers before, entitled, dismissive, impatient. But there was something about Evelyn's cruelty that cut deeper, something in the way she wielded her words like weapons, designed not just to complain, but to humiliate. From the corner of the room, the man in the gray suit observed the exchange in silence. His face remained unreadable, but his fingers tapped lightly against the rim of his glass, slow and deliberate, as if considering every detail of what he had just witnessed. Back at Evelyn's table, the mocking continued. "And did you see how she walked?" Evelyn scoffed, rolling her eyes, like she was barely holding it together. If she can't handle working in a place like this, she should find something more suited to her skill level. Maybe flipping burgers would be more her speed. Around them, other diners shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged uneasy glances, whispering in hushed tones, while others simply shook their heads in quiet disapproval. But Evelyn either didn't notice or didn't care. Moments later, Emily returned, carrying a fresh plate with as much dignity as she could summon. She set it down gently in front of Evelyn, her voice unwavering despite the tightness in her chest. "Here you are, ma'am. I had the chef remake it for you. I hope this meets your expectations." Evelyn gave the plate only a fleeting glance before shrugging. "I suppose it'll do," she said dismissively, her tone dripping with indifference. Then, with a slow, condescending shake of her head, she added, "But next time, try to get it right the first time, and for heaven's sake, learn how to carry yourself. You represent this establishment, and quite frankly, you're doing a terrible job of it." Emily forced a polite smile, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Of course, ma'am. I'll do my best." As she turned away, Evelyn smirked and leaned toward her friends, murmuring just loud enough to be heard. "It's amazing how some people can be so completely incompetent and still believe they deserve respect." At that moment, the man in the gray suit stood. His movements were measured, almost deliberate, as he walked toward the restaurant's manager, who had been hovering near the bar. He leaned in close, speaking in a low voice. The manager's eyes widened slightly, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something far more serious. Meanwhile, Evelyn remained blissfully unaware, lost in conversation, her attention now turned to regaling her friends with tales of her recent vacation. "Oh, the meals were absolutely divine," she mused, twirling the stem of her wine glass between her fingers. "You wouldn't believe how exquisite the private villas were. And the staff? Flawless. Unlike what we've had to deal with tonight." Her friends chuckled in agreement, completely oblivious to the change in atmosphere. Across the room, Emily busied herself stacking trays of glasses, her hands still trembling. She had mastered the art of pushing her emotions aside while working. But tonight, the weight of Evelyn's words clung to her like a second skin. No matter how much she tried to shake it off, the sting remained. Then, as the evening wound down, Evelyn and her friends requested the check. But instead of a waiter, the manager himself approached their table, his expression unreadable. Emily followed a few steps behind him, her posture tense. In his hands, the manager carried a tray bearing a bottle of champagne and a single envelope. Evelyn arched a perfectly sculpted brow, though the faintest flicker of satisfaction danced in her eyes. One of her friends clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, how lovely!" The corners of Evelyn's lips curled. "Well, it's about time someone recognized exceptional patrons," she said smoothly, throwing Emily a pointed glance. But the manager's next words made the air shift around them. "This gesture comes directly from the owner of Donovan's," he announced, setting the envelope down in front of Evelyn. "He has been observing your experience tonight and wanted to personally address it." The smugness on Evelyn's face faltered. "The owner?" she repeated, a note of surprise creeping into her voice. Before the manager could respond, the man in the gray suit stepped forward. The restaurant fell silent. Conversations hushed, glasses stilled midair, every eye drawn to the unfolding moment. He stood at the table with an air of quiet authority, his expression calm but unyielding. And then, with a polite yet unmistakably firm smile, he spoke. "Yes." The man's voice remained steady, firm yet calm. "The owner," he repeated, letting the words settle in the air. "My name is Charles Donovan." He let a pause linger before adding, "And this is my restaurant." Evelyn's jaw tensed, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the stem of her wine glass. A faint flush crept into her cheeks, the realization hitting her like a slow, creeping tide. "Oh, Mr. Donovan, I didn't realize," she faltered, her usual effortless composure slipping as she grasped for the right words. But Charles wasn't interested in pleasantries. He turned slightly, gesturing toward Emily, who stood a short distance away, her eyes cast downward, shoulders drawn inward as if trying to make herself smaller. "Emily here," he said evenly. "Happens to be my niece." His tone remained composed, but there was a quiet weight behind his words. "She is one of the hardest working people I know, and I take great pride in having her as part of my team." The color drained from Evelyn's face. Across the table, her friends exchanged uneasy glances, the laughter that had filled their voices only moments ago now replaced by heavy silence. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I couldn't help but overhear the way you spoke to her tonight," he continued, his gaze never wavering. "And while I understand that mistakes happen, there is a way to address them, with dignity, with respect." Evelyn parted her lips as if to respond, but no words came. Charles leaned in just slightly, his calm presence somehow more commanding than if he had shouted. "Money may grant you luxury," he said, his voice deliberate, each syllable carving through the silence like a blade. "But it does not grant you the right to belittle those who work to provide it." His words weren't just for Evelyn. They were for the entire restaurant, and everyone knew it. The room, once buzzing with quiet conversations, had fallen utterly still. Glasses rested untouched on tables, forks suspended in midair as patrons hung onto his every word. The weight of his statement settled over them like a heavy, inescapable truth. Evelyn, who had basked in her own sense of superiority all evening, now sat stiffly in her seat. Her carefully curated confidence was unraveling before the watchful eyes of an entire room. She swallowed, her fingers fidgeting with the stem of her glass, but there was no escaping the moment. Charles straightened, his eyes sweeping over the table, then across the restaurant itself. "Respect," he said, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "is the foundation of this establishment. Not just respect for the food we serve, but for the people who make it possible. The chefs, the servers, the dishwashers. Every single person behind the scenes contributes to the experience you enjoy." Evelyn opened her mouth again, perhaps to defend herself, but hesitation flickered across her face. Instead, one of her friends, shifting uncomfortably in her chair, broke the silence first. "I'm sure Evelyn didn't mean any harm," she offered weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "Perhaps not," he acknowledged, his tone still measured. "But intention does not erase impact. Words have power, and when they're wielded carelessly, they leave scars that can't always be seen." He turned then, his gaze softening as it landed on Emily. She had remained quiet, caught somewhere between embarrassment and gratitude, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Emily," Charles said gently, "you handled yourself with grace and professionalism tonight, even under unfair scrutiny. I want you to know how incredibly proud I am of you." Emily blinked rapidly, forcing back the tears that threatened to spill. She gave a small nod, unable to trust her voice, but her gratitude was evident in the way her shoulders straightened just slightly, as if the weight she had been carrying all evening had been lifted, even if only a little. Then Charles shifted his focus back to Evelyn. "As for you," he said, his civility unwavering, "I could ask you to leave and not return. That would be the simplest course of action." Evelyn's eyes widened ever so slightly. Across the table, her friends exchanged nervous glances, sensing the shift in power, the way the evening had turned against them in a way none of them had anticipated. But Charles merely gestured toward the champagne bottle that still sat untouched on the tray. "This," he said, his voice calm but deliberate, "was meant to be a gesture of goodwill." And yet, the lesson he was about to deliver would be worth far more than any bottle of champagne. Charles Donovan exhaled softly, his expression unreadable as he set the unopened champagne bottle back onto the tray. Then, with quiet authority, he continued, "Instead of this being a gift to you, I'll be donating its value, along with the cost of your entire tab, to a local organization that supports young women like Emily. Women who work tirelessly to carve out a future for themselves, often in the face of challenges far greater than you could imagine." A murmur rippled through the restaurant, a current of hushed conversation sweeping across the tables. Some diners nodded in quiet approval, others exchanged glances of intrigue and surprise. The shift in atmosphere was palpable, no longer just an evening out, but a moment that carried weight. Evelyn, who had spent years mastering the art of composure, suddenly found herself faltering. When she finally found her voice, it was unsteady, fragile. "Mr. Donovan, I think this is a bit extreme," she stammered, her confidence now a flickering flame. "I didn't mean—" Charles held up a hand. Not harshly, not cruelly, but with the firm insistence of a man who had already made his decision. "This isn't about punishment, Mrs. Monroe," he said evenly. "It's about accountability. I hope that tonight gives you something to reflect on, the kind of impact you leave behind, the kind of legacy you choose to build." His words settled over her like a heavy, inescapable truth. Evelyn looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. Her friends, who had once reveled in her sharp remarks, now sat in uneasy silence, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to say. Charles stepped back, letting his gaze sweep over the room, addressing not just Evelyn, but every soul present. "Let tonight serve as a reminder," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "Kindness costs nothing, but to the person on the receiving end, it can mean everything. You never know what someone is carrying, what burdens they bear, or who might be watching." A soft sound filled the space. Not an uproarious cheer, not dramatic applause, but something far more meaningful. A quiet, genuine acknowledgement from those who understood the depth of what had just transpired. A few patrons nodded, some even casting warm glances toward Emily, as if offering silent encouragement. Evelyn, however, remained frozen in place. Just minutes ago she had commanded the room with effortless dominance. Now she sat small and subdued, her bravado reduced to silence. It was a rare thing for her, to be confronted, to be challenged in a way that left no room for witty retorts or indignant protests, and she had no idea how to respond. Charles turned to Emily, his expression softening. "Take a short break," he told her gently. "You've earned it." For a moment, Emily hesitated. Then she nodded, quickly wiping her hands on her apron before disappearing through the kitchen doors. As she walked away, her posture was different, her steps steadier, her shoulders no longer weighed down by shame. But the moment didn't end there. The ripples of that exchange carried far beyond the walls of Donovan's. As the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the atmosphere remained changed, charged with something more than just the lingering sense of fine cuisine. The patrons whispered amongst themselves, not about the food or the decor, but about what they had just witnessed. The quiet man in the gray suit had reminded them of something profound, that decency and respect were not just niceties, but necessities. At the back of the restaurant, Emily leaned against the wall, inhaling deeply, trying to steady the emotions that churned inside her. Her manager approached, a kind smile softening his normally serious expression. "You handled yourself beautifully tonight," he told her. "Not many would have stayed as composed as you did." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone noticed." The manager shook his head. "They noticed," he assured her. "Especially Mr. Donovan." Back in the dining area, Charles returned to his table, lifting his glass of water as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But as a few patrons passed by on their way out, they stopped, offering small nods of respect, murmuring words of appreciation. One older gentleman even paused at his side. "You don't see people stand up like that often anymore," he said, his voice thoughtful. "That was something special." Charles offered a faint smile. "It wasn't about standing up," he replied. "It was about reminding everyone, myself included, that kindness is the least we owe each other." At the entrance, Evelyn and her friends rose to leave. But this time, there was no laughter, no playful tossing of remarks. Evelyn's usual air of self-assurance was gone, replaced by something quieter, something unsure. Her stride, once effortless, had lost its confidence, reduced to something hesitant. At the door, she paused. For the first time all evening, she seemed to take in the room not as a stage for her own performance, but as something else entirely. The diners weren't sneering at her. The staff wasn't gloating. Instead, there was simply a quiet understanding, a collective hope that maybe, just maybe, she would walk away from this night a little different than when she had arrived. Outside, the cool night air brushed against her skin. Her friends, sensing the shift in her mood, murmured hollow reassurances, offering weak attempts at comfort. But Evelyn barely heard them. She waved them off, murmuring that she needed a moment. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, Emily stepped back onto the floor. She moved between tables with newfound confidence, her warm smile now unburdened by doubt. And as she passed, diners met her eyes, not just seeing a waitress, but a young woman who had faced cruelty with grace, who had stood tall even when it was easier to shrink. The night came to a quiet close, but the lesson lingered long after the last plate was cleared. As the evening drew to a quiet close, the doors of Donovan's swung shut behind the last departing patrons. Yet the echoes of what had transpired lingered in the air like an unspoken understanding. Some guests, moved by the night's events, left behind more generous tips than usual, small gestures of appreciation for the staff they might have overlooked before. Others paused to exchange kind words with the servers and kitchen workers, recognizing them not just as part of the backdrop of their evening, but as people, each carrying their own burdens and dreams. And then there was Evelyn. She stepped out into the cool night, her usual self-assured stride tempered by something unfamiliar, a quiet humility. She had entered the restaurant certain of who she was, confident in the way the world worked in her favor. But now she walked away with the undeniable weight of a lesson she hadn't expected to learn. A part of her, though she would never say it aloud, felt as though the foundation of her world had shifted ever so slightly beneath her feet. From inside, Charles Donovan watched through the window, his expression unreadable. There was no smug satisfaction in his gaze, no sense of triumph. He simply sat there, knowing that a small but meaningful point had been made. Because in the end, life was never truly about wealth, influence, or the fleeting power that came with them. It was about something far greater. It was about the way we treat the people who cross our paths, the ones who serve us, who work behind the scenes, who ask for nothing but basic decency. It was about recognizing their worth, not through grand gestures or public displays, but in the quiet, everyday choices we make. And perhaps, if more people remembered that simple truth, the world would begin to feel a little softer, a little more humane. If this story speaks to you, share it with someone who might need a gentle reminder of the power of kindness. And if you believe in stories that inspire reflection and change, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment to open someone's eyes, and one act of respect to make all the difference.